The thermometer outside Eli's cabin window read -47 degrees, and the propane had run out 3 hours ago. At 12 years old, most kids would be panicking, crying for their parents, or worse, giving up. But Eli wasn't most kids. He was the grandson of Magnus Thornfield, the legendary mountain survivalist who disappeared 5 winters ago, leaving behind only cryptic drawings carved into the cabin's floorboards. As hypothermia crept through the walls like a living thing, Eli traced his fingers along the strange geometric patterns his grandfather had etched into the wood, circles within squares, spirals that seemed to pulse with warmth. The moment he pressed his palm to the center symbol, something impossible happened. Heat, real, life-saving heat, began radiating up through the floor, turning his frozen refuge into a pocket of survival against nature's deadliest assault. Outside, the storm that had already killed 3 experienced hikers raged on, but inside, Eli was discovering that his grandfather hadn't just been a survivalist, he'd been something far more extraordinary. But what ancient knowledge had Magnus hidden in those floorboards, and why did the cabin suddenly feel like it was breathing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eli pulled his hand back from the carved symbol, his breath no longer forming white clouds in the air. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. The bone-deep cold that had been seeping into his core was retreating, replaced by a gentle warmth that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the cabin. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Never trust what seems obvious, boy. The mountain keeps her secrets in plain sight." Magnus had said this while they'd sat by the fire last summer, the old man's weathered hands sketching patterns in the ash, patterns that looked remarkably similar to what was now glowing faintly beneath Eli's feet. The wind outside howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past in hypnotic sheets. 3 days ago, when his parents had dropped him off for what was supposed to be a weekend adventure with Grandpa Magnus's old cabin, the weather forecast had called for light snow. Nothing that would concern a family with mountain experience, nothing that would trap a 12-year-old boy alone when the emergency radio crackled to life with news of the storm's deadly turn. The radio. Eli scrambled across the warming floor to where the battery-powered device sat silent on the kitchen counter. He'd turned it off hours ago to conserve power, but now curiosity overwhelmed conservation. The static filled the small cabin as he tuned through frequencies, finally catching the tail end of a weather bulletin. Search and rescue operations suspended until conditions improve. The death toll from this unprecedented storm system has risen to 3, with 7 more missing in the Cascade Range. Temperatures are expected to drop another 15 degrees overnight before... Eli switched it off. 7 missing. He wondered if anyone had noticed he wasn't where he was supposed to be. His parents thought he was safely in town with his Aunt Sarah. Aunt Sarah thought he'd changed his mind about the cabin visit and stayed home. The kind of miscommunication that seemed harmless until nature decided to test it. But the floor beneath him continued to radiate impossible warmth. Eli knelt and examined the patterns more closely. The wood itself wasn't warm. When he touched areas outside the carved lines, they remained cold as ice. Only the symbols themselves generated heat, and only when touched, as if they were responding to him specifically. He remembered finding these markings during his first day alone, initially dismissing them as his grandfather's woodworking hobby. Magnus had been famous throughout the valley for his craftsmanship, his furniture sought after by wealthy city folks who wanted authentic mountain decor for their vacation homes. But this was different. This was functional in a way that defied everything Eli understood about the world. The cabin groaned around him, not from wind stress but from something deeper, a rhythmic settling that matched his own breathing. When he inhaled, the walls seemed to expand slightly. When he exhaled, they contracted. The sensation was so subtle he might have imagined it, except the geometric patterns on the floor pulsed in the same rhythm. Eli pressed both palms to the largest spiral, a design roughly the size of a dinner plate carved near the cabin's center. The heat intensified, spreading up through his arms and into his chest. But something else came with it, a sensation like memory that wasn't his own. Images of his grandfather working by lamplight, not carving decorative patterns but solving an ancient puzzle. Mathematics that looked more like art, engineering disguised as folk design. Outside, something crashed, probably a tree falling under the weight of ice. The sound should have terrified him, alone as he was in the wilderness, with no way to call for help. Instead, as warmth continued flowing from the mysterious floor beneath him, Eli felt the first stirring of something he hadn't expected: excitement. His grandfather hadn't just survived these mountains for 78 years. He'd learned to make them his partner. And somehow, impossible as it seemed, Magnus had built that partnership into the very bones of this cabin. Eli was about to discover just how deep that partnership went. The radio crackled to life just as Eli finished his third bowl of oatmeal, the static voice cutting through the cabin's silence like a knife through butter. He scrambled across the wooden floor, nearly tripping over his grandfather's reading chair in his haste to reach the old emergency radio perched on the kitchen counter. Temperatures dropping to -42 degrees Fahrenheit. This is now officially the worst blizzard to hit the Cascade Valley in recorded history. Emergency services have suspended all rescue operations until further notice. If you can hear this broadcast, stay indoors, conserve fuel, and... The transmission dissolved into white noise, then nothing. Eli twisted the dials frantically, but only silence answered him back. He pressed his face against the frost-covered window and peered out into what should have been morning daylight. The world beyond the glass was a swirling wall of white, so dense he couldn't even see the pine tree that grew just 10 feet from the cabin's front porch. His breath fogged the glass as reality settled into his 12-year-old mind like a stone dropping into still water. Grandpa Joe wasn't coming back today. Maybe not tomorrow either. The old man had driven down to Miller's Creek yesterday morning for supplies, promising to return by evening. That was 18 hours ago. Eli's stomach clenched, and not from hunger. 3 people dead in the valley. The radio had been clear about that before it died completely. He wondered if Grandpa Joe was somewhere safe, maybe holed up in the general store or at the Hendersons' farm. He had to be. The alternative was unthinkable. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, followed by the groaning protest of wood under stress. Eli spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had come from the main beam that ran across the living room ceiling. Snow load, Grandpa Joe had taught him about that. Too much weight on the roof could bring the whole structure down. He grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the emergency kit and pulled on his boots, making his way to the front door. The moment he cracked it open, the wind hit him like a physical blow, driving needles of ice into his exposed face. He managed 3 steps onto the covered porch before the cold forced him back inside, gasping and shivering. The snow was already 3 feet deep on the porch and climbing fast. At this rate, he'd be completely buried by nightfall. Back inside, Eli checked the wood-burning stove that provided the cabin's heat. The fire was burning low, and a glance at the wood box beside it made his chest tight with worry. Maybe enough split logs for 2 days, 3 if he was careful. After that, he'd have to venture outside to the woodshed, assuming he could even find it in this whiteout. He fed 2 more pieces to the fire and adjusted the damper, remembering his grandfather's patient lessons from summers past. "Fire is life up here, boy," the old man always said. "Respect it, tend it, and it'll take care of you. Neglect it, and the mountain will claim you faster than you can say hypothermia." The wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every small gap in the weatherproofing and exploiting it mercilessly. Cold air leaked in around the windows and beneath the doors, creating treacherous drafts that stole precious heat. Eli dragged blankets and towels from the linen closet, stuffing them into the worst gaps, but it felt like trying to stop a river with his bare hands. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to the strange pattern carved into the wooden floor near the fireplace. He'd first noticed it yesterday while helping Grandpa Joe arrange furniture. though the old man had seemed oddly reluctant to discuss it when asked. The design was intricate, almost maze-like, with interlocking spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles. Now, crouched beside it with his flashlight, Eli could see details that had escaped him before. Some of the carved lines were deeper than others, creating subtle channels in the wood. More intriguingly, certain sections appeared to be lined with what looked like thin strips of metal, copper maybe or brass, tarnished with age. He traced one of the spirals with his finger, surprised to find that the metal inlay felt warmer than the surrounding wood. That was odd. Everything else in the cabin was steadily losing heat to the storm outside, but these thin metal lines seemed to hold warmth, like tiny radiators. Another crack echoed from the ceiling beam, followed by a shower of dust and wood chips. Eli looked up nervously, then back down at the mysterious pattern beneath his knees. Whatever this thing was, Grandpa Joe had built the cabin around it, positioned it deliberately near the fireplace where it would catch the most heat and light. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in its howling voice, Eli thought he could hear the mountain itself calling his name. The radio crackled to life at dawn, yanking Eli from a restless sleep. He'd spent the night on the living room couch, wrapped in every blanket he could find, listening to the wind howl like a living thing trying to claw its way inside. Emergency broadcast continues. 3 confirmed fatalities in Millbrook Valley due to exposure. Temperatures dropped to -42 degrees overnight, with wind chills reaching -60. All residents are advised to remain indoors and conserve heating fuel. Rescue operations are suspended until conditions improve. Eli's stomach clenched. 3 people were dead. The same storm that had stranded him here was killing people just a few miles away. He fumbled for the radio dial, trying to catch more information, but static swallowed the transmission. The cabin felt like an icebox. His breath came out in white puffs, and frost had formed on the inside of the windows during the night. The fire had died to cold ashes hours ago, and when he checked the woodpile beside the fireplace, his heart sank. Maybe enough for one more day, if he was careful. He slammed the door shut, his exposed skin already burning from the brief exposure. Think, Eli told himself. Grandpa Joe had survived up here for 30 years. There had to be other options. Back in the kitchen, he opened every cabinet and drawer, taking inventory. Canned soup, crackers, peanut butter, some dried fruit, enough food for maybe a week if he rationed carefully. But without heat, the pipes would freeze, and without heat, he would freeze. That's when he remembered the basement. Grandpa Joe had always been secretive about the basement, claiming it was just storage for old junk. But last summer, when Eli had snuck down there looking for fishing tackle, he'd noticed something odd about the floor. Most of the basement had a standard concrete slab, but in the center was an elaborate mosaic pattern made of smooth river stones. The stones were arranged in concentric circles with strange symbols worked into the design, symbols that looked almost like letters, but from no alphabet Eli recognized. When he'd asked about it, Grandpa Joe had gotten that distant look he sometimes wore and muttered something about old family traditions before changing the subject. Now, as Eli descended the creaking wooden stairs with a flashlight, that pattern seemed to call to him. The basement was noticeably warmer than the rest of the cabin, which made no sense. There was no heating vent down here, no fireplace, no electrical heater that he could see. He knelt beside the stone pattern, running his flashlight beam over the intricate design. The stones were smooth and dark, each one carefully placed. Some had symbols carved into their surface, spirals, interlocking triangles, shapes that hurt his eyes to look at directly. In the very center was a larger stone, about the size of his palm, with a deep depression worn into its surface. As he studied the pattern, fragments of old conversations with Grandpa Joe drifted back to him. Stories told during long winter evenings, tales Eli had always assumed were just family folklore. Stories about his great-great-grandfather who'd first settled in these mountains during a particularly brutal winter in 1889. How he'd somehow survived when other homesteaders had perished. how he'd taught his sons certain old ways of living with the mountain's moods. "Every family's got its secrets, boy," Grandpa Joe had said once, staring into the fire with those pale blue eyes. "Some secrets are meant to die with the telling, others are meant to save lives when the time comes." Eli placed his hand on the center stone. It was warm, not just room temperature, but actually warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. The moment his palm made contact with the depression, he felt something shift, not in the stone, but in himself. A tingling sensation ran up his arm, and suddenly he could sense something vast and patient stirring beneath the cabin. The basement grew warmer. It wasn't his imagination. Within minutes, the oppressive cold that had been seeping through the walls began to recede. The flashlight revealed no visible change in the room, but warmth was definitely rising from somewhere below, as if the earth itself had awakened. Upstairs, the radio crackled again with reports of the storm intensifying. But down here, surrounded by his family's mysterious legacy, Eli felt the first spark of hope since the blizzard began. The storm's fury had intensified overnight, transforming the world outside into a white void that pressed against the cabin windows like searching fingers. Eli woke to the sound of wood groaning under the weight of accumulating snow, and when he peered through the frost-covered glass, he could barely make out the outline of the old oak tree 20 feet away. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he hurried to the fireplace. The embers from last night had died to ash, and the temperature inside had dropped dangerously low. His fingers, already stiff with cold, fumbled with the matches as he tried to relight the fire. 3 matches snapped before the 4th caught, sending blessed warmth flickering back to life. While the flames slowly rebuilt their strength, Eli's eyes drifted to the floor pattern he'd discovered yesterday. In the morning light filtering through the storm, the geometric design seemed more pronounced, as if the cold itself had somehow sharpened its edges. He knelt beside it, running his palm across the wood, and noticed something he'd missed before. Tiny holes drilled at precise intervals along the pattern's perimeter, each no bigger than a pencil tip. The rational part of his mind insisted it was just decorative inlay, perhaps something his grandfather had commissioned years ago. But something deeper, more instinctive, whispered that this was far more significant. The holes seemed deliberately placed, following a mathematical sequence he couldn't quite grasp. A sharp crack from outside made him jump. Through the window, he watched a massive pine branch surrender to the storm's weight, crashing down with enough force to shake the ground. The sight sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. If a branch that size could snap like a twig, what might happen to the cabin's roof under all that accumulating snow? He needed to think practically about survival. Food, water, warmth, these were immediate concerns. But as he moved through the cabin taking inventory, his gaze kept returning to the floor pattern. His grandfather had been methodical about everything, from organizing his tools to maintaining detailed weather journals. Nothing in this cabin existed without purpose. In the kitchen, Eli found enough canned goods to last several days if he rationed carefully. The hand pump at the sink still worked, drawing water from what must be a deep well that hadn't frozen. But the real challenge would be fuel for the fire. The wood pile on the porch was already buried under 3 feet of snow, and venturing outside in these conditions would be suicide. His heart began to race. Moving systematically around the pattern's perimeter, he found 11 more pegs, each positioned at what seemed like critical junctures in the design. When he tried pressing them in different combinations, nothing happened. But when he followed the pattern's flow, starting from what appeared to be its beginning point and moving clockwise, the 7th peg clicked distinctly into place. The sound was different, more final, as if it had locked into position. Encouraged, he continued following the pattern's logic, pressing each peg in sequence. When he reached the final one, a deep mechanical groan echoed through the cabin. For a moment, nothing visible changed. Then, slowly, a section of the floor within the pattern's center began to rise, revealing hidden hinges and the edge of a concealed compartment. Eli's hands trembled as he lifted what proved to be a perfectly fitted wooden panel. Beneath lay a collection of items that made no immediate sense. Rolled papers covered in diagrams and calculations, several small metal instruments he couldn't identify, and a leather journal bound with string. But it was the loose photographs that made him gasp. They showed the valley below, but not as he knew it. These images captured a thriving community, dozens of houses, cultivated fields, people gathered in what looked like celebration. The dates on the photos' backs spanned decades, but the most recent was from 15 years ago. Now, only 3 families remained in the valley year-round, and even they struggled through each winter. Whatever had happened to transform that thriving community into the nearly abandoned valley he knew had occurred within his own lifetime. He opened the journal with reverent care. His grandfather's familiar handwriting filled the pages, but the content was unlike anything in his weather logs. These entries spoke of thermal management systems, community heat distribution, and emergency protocols. Sketches showed networks of underground channels and what appeared to be a sophisticated heating system centered on this very cabin. As wind howled around the cabin with renewed force, Eli realized he might be holding the key to something far more important than his own survival. Outside, the storm that had already claimed 3 lives continued its relentless assault on the valley. But inside, surrounded by his grandfather's hidden knowledge, he began to understand that this pattern beneath his feet might be the beginning of salvation for everyone below. The storm's fury had transformed the world outside into a white void, but inside the cabin, Eli knelt beside the strange pattern carved into the floorboards, his breath visible in small puffs despite the warmth radiating from beneath his hands. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, responding to his touch in ways that defied everything he thought he knew about wood and stone and the natural world. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, its pages yellowed and brittle. Eli had found it tucked beneath a loose board near the fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from decades of mountain moisture. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, filled with sketches that matched the floor pattern exactly. "The old ways are not lost," his grandfather had written. "They sleep, waiting for need great enough to wake them. The pattern is a map, but also a key." Sarah understood this. The children must be taught. Eli traced the central spiral with his fingertip, feeling the wood warm beneath his touch. According to the journal, his great-grandmother Sarah had been the last keeper of something his grandfather called the mountain's gift. She had carved this pattern during the terrible winter of 1952, when an ice storm had trapped the entire valley for 3 weeks and supplies had run dangerously low. The radio crackled to life behind him, cutting through his concentration. "Confirmed now that Highway 9 is completely impassable. Search and rescue operations have been suspended until the storm passes. If you can hear this, stay where you are. Do not attempt to travel. 3 fatalities have been reported in Millbrook Valley due to exposure." Eli's stomach clenched. Millbrook Valley was only 5 miles down the mountain. Those people had died while he sat here in supernatural warmth, protected by something he didn't understand. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, but it was followed immediately by a realization that made his hands shake as he turned the journal's pages. His grandfather hadn't just been a hermit living alone on the mountain. He'd been a guardian, watching over the valley below. The journal entries grew more frantic toward the end, filled with references to the responsibility and the terrible choice coming. In the margins, Sarah's name appeared again and again, along with sketched maps of the surrounding peaks and what looked like additional pattern locations. She tried to teach the others, one entry read, but fear won over wisdom. They called it witchcraft, drove her deeper into the mountains. The pattern here is just one piece. To save them all, the network must be restored. Eli looked up from the journal, studying the cabin with new eyes. This wasn't just his grandfather's retreat. It was a station, a single point in some larger system designed to protect the valley. But protect it from what? The answer came to him as he listened to the wind's howling intensity outside. This wasn't a normal storm. His phone, which had been dead since the previous evening, suddenly buzzed with a text message. The display showed impossible full bars despite the remote location. The message was from a number he didn't recognize. The pattern wakes. Others sleep cold below. Will you let them die as your grandfather did? The Eastern Ridge cabin holds the second key. S. Eli's blood ran cold. His grandfather had died 3 months ago of a heart attack in this very cabin, alone. But according to the journal, that timing coincided exactly with when the early winter storms had begun devastating the region. Had his grandfather's death somehow broken whatever protection the pattern provided? He looked down at the glowing symbols beneath his knees. The warmth was stronger now, almost uncomfortable, as if responding to his growing understanding. According to the journal's sketches, this pattern connected to at least 2 others, one at the Eastern Ridge cabin mentioned in the mysterious text, and another somewhere near the valley floor. The radio crackled again, temperature dropping to -27 degrees, wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour. This is now classified as an extreme weather emergency. Eli made his decision. He couldn't stay warm and safe while people died below. His 12-year-old legs might not be strong enough for mountain hiking in a blizzard, but the journal suggested the patterns could do more than just provide heat. Sarah's notes mentioned walking the warm paths, and the mountain's protection extends to those who serve it. He gathered supplies: the journal, his grandfather's heavy winter coat, emergency flares from the kitchen drawer, and a compass that had belonged to his great-grandmother. According to the journal, it would point toward active patterns rather than magnetic north. As he prepared to leave the cabin's warmth, Eli placed both hands flat on the pattern's center spiral. The wood grew almost hot beneath his palms, and he felt something flow into him, not just heat but knowledge. Images flashed through his mind, paths through the storm that the wind couldn't touch, safe routes between the peaks, and most importantly, the location of 12 people trapped in a collapsed shelter near the Eastern Ridge. The mysterious text sender was right. He could save them, but first he had to become what his grandfather and great-grandmother had been before him, a keeper of the mountain's ancient promise to protect those below. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Eli woke from his restless sleep. He'd managed maybe 3 hours curled against the wall where the carved symbols felt warmest, but every sound outside had jolted him awake. The cabin creaked like an old ship, and somewhere in the distance he could swear he heard voices calling through the snow. His breath came out in visible puffs as he sat up, joints stiff with cold. The fire had burned down to barely glowing embers, but the section of floor beneath him still radiated that impossible warmth. Eli pressed his palm flat against the nearest spiral carving, and the wood responded with a gentle pulse that traveled up his arm. "What are you?" he whispered to the pattern. As if in answer, his stomach growled loud enough to echo off the walls. Eli realized he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a lifetime ago, before the storm had turned the world into a frozen wasteland. He needed to find food, but more importantly, he needed to understand what was happening beneath his feet. Eli crawled across the floor, following the carved lines with his fingertips. The pattern was more complex than he'd initially realized. What had seemed like simple spirals were actually interconnected channels that formed a massive geometric design covering nearly the entire cabin floor. Some sections felt warm to the touch, others remained cold as the surrounding wood. There was a logic to it, a system he couldn't quite grasp. In the pale morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows, Eli noticed something else. Thin lines of condensation had formed along certain carved channels, as if warm air was rising through them. He leaned closer and felt the faintest breath of heat against his cheek. His grandfather's journal lay where he'd dropped it the night before. Eli grabbed it with numb fingers and flipped through pages of dense handwriting, looking for anything about the floor pattern. Most entries were mundane: weather observations, supply lists, notes about wildlife. But then, buried in the middle pages, he found a sketch that made his heart race. The drawing showed the cabin floor pattern from above, with careful annotations in his grandfather's precise handwriting. Lines connected different sections of the design to words Eli didn't recognize: thermal channel, circulation matrix, ground heat exchange. Numbers were scattered throughout, calculations that meant nothing to him but suggested this wasn't just decorative carving. At the bottom of the page, in darker ink as if added later, his grandfather had written, "The old ways still work." What the Anishinaabe knew about moving Earth's warmth through wood, we forgot, but the mountain remembers. Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The Anishinaabe, he remembered his grandfather mentioning them before. The original people of this region, who had survived here long before modern heating systems or insulated buildings. But how could carved wood move heat? A sharp crack from outside broke his concentration. Eli scrambled to the window and scraped away enough frost to peer out. The world beyond was a uniform white, sculpted by wind into strange, flowing shapes. But there, a dark speck moving across the distant slope. Someone on snowshoes, moving slowly but steadily toward the cabin. Eli's heart leaped. Rescue! But as the figure drew closer, he could see it was just one person, struggling against snow that came up to their waist even with snowshoes. Whoever it was wouldn't be able to take him down the mountain in these conditions. They were probably in as much danger as he was. He watched the figure's progress, noting how they stopped frequently to rest, how their movements grew more labored with each step. By the time they reached the cabin's front door, Eli could hear their ragged breathing through the walls. The knock, when it came, was weak, barely audible over the wind. Eli rushed to the door, then hesitated. His grandfather had always warned him about opening doors to strangers in the wilderness, but the alternative was letting someone freeze to death on his doorstep. He pulled the heavy door open, fighting against the wind that tried to slam it shut. A woman stumbled inside, snow-covered and shaking so violently she could barely stand. Ice had formed around her hood and scarf, and her lips were blue beneath the frost. "Thank God," she gasped, pulling off her hood to reveal graying hair and kind eyes. "I'm Sarah Chen from the ranger station. Are you Eli Morrison?" Eli nodded, helping her toward the warm section of floor. "How did you find me?" Sarah collapsed gratefully onto the carved pattern, immediately sighing as the warmth hit her. "Your grandfather called in your location before the storm hit communication lines, but I can't get you out, not yet. The temperature dropped to 40 below last night. 3 more people died in town." She looked around the cabin with professional eyes, taking in the dying fire and their desperate situation. "How are you staying warm? This place should be an icebox." Eli glanced down at the floor pattern, feeling heat pulse against his knees. "I'm not sure you'd believe me." The storm had been raging for 3 days when Eli first heard the voices. At first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, the way it howled through the gaps in the cabin's weathered logs. But as he knelt on the wooden floor, tracing the intricate pattern with his fingertips for what felt like the 100th time, the whispers became clearer. They weren't coming from outside, they were rising from beneath his hands. The pattern itself had grown warmer since that first night. What started as simple carved lines now seemed to pulse with a gentle heat that spread up through his palms and into his arms. Eli had stopped questioning it. When you're 12 years old and facing death by freezing, you don't argue with miracles. He pressed his ear to the floor, listening intently. The voices were definitely there, speaking in hushed tones he couldn't quite understand. They sounded urgent, almost pleading. Eli closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to make sense of the words that seemed to dance just beyond comprehension. Eli jerked upright, his heart hammering. The voices faded immediately, leaving only the familiar roar of the blizzard outside. He stared down at the carved symbols, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Despite the warmth emanating from the pattern, the cabin was still brutally cold everywhere else. Rising on shaky legs, Eli stumbled to the window and scraped away the ice crystals that had formed on the inside of the glass. The world beyond was a wall of white. Snow had drifted halfway up the cabin's walls, and the wind was so fierce it bent the massive pine trees nearly horizontal. 3 people had died in the valley below. He'd heard it on Grandpa's old radio before the batteries finally gave out yesterday morning. The broadcast had been crackling and broken, but the message was clear. The storm was unlike anything in recorded history, and rescue operations were impossible. Eli was on his own. He returned to the pattern, kneeling carefully within its boundaries. The moment his knees touched the floor inside the carved lines, warmth enveloped him like an invisible blanket. It was the only reason he was still alive, and he knew it. But the voices had mentioned something about the pattern needing to be complete. Eli studied the intricate design more carefully than ever before. In the flickering light of his last candle, he could see that some sections were indeed missing. What he'd taken for natural wear in the old floorboards were actually gaps, deliberate spaces where additional carvings should exist. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, its pages filled with cryptic notes and sketches that Eli was only beginning to understand. One page showed the complete pattern, with detailed drawings of the missing sections. Another page contained what looked like coordinates and a date from 40 years ago. "The Hartwell family has been the guardians for 7 generations," read one passage in his grandfather's careful handwriting. "When the great cold comes, as it has come before, the pattern must be awakened fully. Only then can it protect not just the guardian, but all those within the valley's embrace." Eli's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Guardian. His grandfather had been preparing him for this, hadn't he? All those summers spent at the cabin, learning to carve wood, to read the mountains, to understand the old stories that Grandpa claimed were more than just legends. Panic clawed at his throat, but the warmth from the pattern kept him grounded. "Think," he told himself. "Grandpa wouldn't have left him here to die. There had to be a way to complete the pattern." Eli grabbed his grandfather's carving tools from the wooden chest near the fireplace. His hands were stiff with cold, but determination drove him forward. Using the journal's detailed sketches as a guide, he began carving the missing sections of the pattern. The work was painstakingly slow. Each line had to be precise, each symbol perfectly formed. As he carved, the existing pattern grew noticeably warmer, and the whispered voices returned, clearer now. "Yes, the bloodline remembers. Complete the circle before moonrise. The valley depends on you." Eli's eyes widened as understanding dawned. This wasn't just about his survival. It was about everyone trapped in the storm below. The pattern was some kind of protective barrier, but only when complete. His grandfather had been the previous guardian, and now, with the old man gone, the responsibility had fallen to Eli. Another beam groaned ominously overhead, and more snow cascaded through the widening crack. Time was running out. Eli kept carving, his young hands guided by instinct and generations of inherited knowledge he was only now beginning to comprehend. The pattern had to be finished before the cabin collapsed around him. The carved symbols beneath Eli's fingertips seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, matching the thunderous beating of his heart. He traced the intricate pattern again, feeling the slight warmth that emanated from the ancient wood, a warmth that defied every law of nature he thought he knew. Outside, the blizzard's fury had intensified, rattling the cabin windows with such violence that he feared the glass might shatter at any moment. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, pages flickering in the dancing light of the oil lamp. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, as if Papa Joe had been racing against time to record what he'd discovered. Eli read the passage again, his lips moving silently as he absorbed each word. The pattern responds to intention, not just touch. Clara proved this when she saved the Hendersons' boy from the fever, but the cost nearly broke her. Clara. His great-grandmother, the woman Papa Joe spoke of in whispers, the one who supposedly knew things others couldn't understand. Eli had always assumed the stories were just mountain folklore, tales spun to entertain a curious grandson. Now, with his fingers pressed against wood that hummed with impossible energy, those stories felt like instructions for survival. The radio crackled to life again, breaking through his concentration. Search efforts suspended due to zero visibility. The death toll has risen to 5, with 2 children still missing in the upper valley. Temperatures have dropped to -38 degrees, making this the deadliest storm in recorded. Eli switched it off with shaking hands. 5 dead. And somewhere out there, 2 kids like him were fighting for their lives. The weight of Papa Joe's secret pressed down on him like the snow accumulating on the cabin's roof. If the pattern truly worked, if it could do what the journal claimed, then he was the only person who could help those children. But first, he had to figure out how. The journal's next entry was dated 3 days before Papa Joe's death. The handwriting was weaker, more labored. Eli shows the sensitivity. Watched him yesterday when he touched the old fence post. He felt it. I could see it in his eyes. Sarah doesn't understand why I insist on teaching him the old ways, but she will. They all will when the time comes. Eli's breath caught. The fence post. He remembered that day clearly now, the strange tingling sensation when he'd grabbed the weathered wood, the way Papa Joe had watched him with those sharp, knowing eyes. At the time, Eli had dismissed it as static electricity or imagination. Now he understood it had been a test. He returned to the pattern, this time focusing not just on the physical sensation, but on his intention. Help, he thought desperately. Help those kids. Help everyone trapped by this storm. The carved lines grew warmer beneath his palms, and suddenly the cabin's interior temperature seemed to stabilize, as if an invisible shield had formed around the walls. The journal revealed more secrets as he read deeper. Clara hadn't just used the pattern to heal. She'd somehow extended its protection to other houses, other families scattered across the mountain. But the process had aged her rapidly, each use taking something vital from her. Papa Joe had been more cautious, using it sparingly, never attempting what his mother had done in her final years. A tremendous crack echoed through the cabin as something heavy struck the roof. Eli looked up to see a dark stain spreading across the ceiling where melting snow was beginning to seep through. The storm was trying to tear apart his shelter, and even with the Pattern S protection, the cabin was only wood and nails against nature's full fury. He made his decision. Racing to Papa Joe's bedroom, Eli rummaged through the old trunk at the foot of the bed. Buried beneath moth-eaten quilts and yellowed photographs, he found what he was looking for. A hand-drawn map of the entire valley marked with dozens of small symbols that matched the pattern carved into the cabin floor. Each symbol was positioned over a house, a family home where people were fighting the same battle he was. Back in the main room, Eli spread the map beside the journal and knelt over the pattern once more. This time, he didn't just think about helping, he visualized each marked location, imagined the protective warmth flowing from his cabin through invisible channels to reach every home in the valley. The pattern responded immediately, growing so warm that he had to lift his hands to avoid being burned. Outside, the wind's howling took on a different quality, less chaotic and more purposeful. The cabin stopped shaking, the leak in the ceiling slowed to a drip, then stopped entirely, and somewhere in the distance, carried on currents of air that defied the blizzard's violence. Eli could swear he heard voices calling out in wonder rather than fear. The pattern was working. But as warmth spread through the network of protected homes, Eli felt something cold taking its place in his chest, a hollow sensation that reminded him of Clara's fate. The power came with a price, and he was already beginning to pay it. The wind had changed during the night, and Eli woke to an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. The constant howling that had become his lullaby for the past 3 days had vanished, replaced by something far more sinister, the heavy quiet that preceded nature's cruelest tricks. He pressed his face to the frost-covered window and gasped. The world outside had transformed into something alien. Snow had drifted so high against the cabin that only the top half of the window remained visible, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of white. But it wasn't the snow that made his heart race. It was the unnatural blue tinge creeping across the glass, the kind of color that meant temperatures had plummeted beyond anything he'd experienced. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, and his breath formed clouds in the cabin's interior. The mysterious floor pattern beneath his feet felt ice-cold through his socks, its stones seeming to pulse with a different kind of energy than before, something urgent and warning. Eli scrambled to rebuild the fire, his fingers clumsy with cold. As flames began to lick at the kindling, he noticed something that made him freeze mid-motion. The pattern on the floor was changing again, but not in the warm, welcoming way it had before. The stones seemed dimmer, their inner light flickering like dying stars, and the spiral that had felt so protective now appeared to be contracting, pulling inward. A memory surfaced, something his grandfather had muttered during one of his rambling stories about the old days, something about the pattern being a warning system, a way for the mountain to speak to those who knew how to listen. But what was it trying to tell him? The radio crackled to life without warning, making him jump. Through waves of static, a desperate voice emerged. Anyone out there? Trapped in the ranger station. Temperatures dropping past -30, losing power. If someone can hear this. Eli lunged for the radio, nearly knocking over his water bottle. Hello? Hello, this is Eli. Can you hear me? The static cleared for a moment, and a woman's voice came through, tight with fear and exhaustion. Oh, thank God someone's there. This is Ranger Matthews at the Valley Station. We've got 7 people trapped here, including 2 kids. Our heating system failed an hour ago, and we're burning furniture to stay warm. The emergency shelter collapsed under snow weight. We need help, but nobody can get through this storm. Eli's mind raced. 7 people. The ranger station was maybe 2 miles down the mountain. He could see its antenna from the cabin's back window on clear days, but in this weather, it might as well have been on the moon. How long can you hold out? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Maybe 6 hours if we're lucky. The kids, they're not doing well. We've got them bundled together, but... Her voice cracked. Listen, kid, we've sent out distress calls, but all the rescue teams are dealing with emergencies in the main towns. We're on our own up here. Eli stared down at the floor pattern, watching the spiral continue its slow contraction. Suddenly, his grandfather's words echoed in his memory with crystal clarity. When the stones grow dim and the spiral tightens, the mountain is gathering its strength. It's preparing to share what it has, but only with those brave enough to ask. A wild idea began to form in his mind. The pattern had been warming the cabin, somehow drawing heat from the mountain itself. If that was true, if the stories about his family's connection to this place had any basis in reality, then maybe there was a way to extend that warmth beyond these walls. He knelt beside the spiral's center, placing both hands on the largest stone. It felt different now. Not just cold, but somehow expectant, like it was waiting for something. Closing his eyes, he tried to remember every detail of his grandfather's stories about the old ceremonies, the way their ancestors had worked with the mountain's energy to survive the harshest winters. Please, he whispered to the pattern, to the mountain, to whatever force had kept this cabin warm when logic said it should be frozen solid. Not just for me, for them too. Show me how to help them. The stone beneath his hands suddenly flared with heat, and the entire pattern blazed to life with an intensity that made him shield his eyes. But instead of the gentle warmth he'd grown accustomed to, this felt different, purposeful, directed, like energy building towards something specific. Images flashed through his mind, underground passages, thermal vents, a network of natural heat sources that honeycombed the mountain, and, most importantly, a way to redirect that energy, to channel it toward the ranger station, where 7 people were running out of time. He opened his eyes and grabbed the radio with shaking hands. The plan forming in his head was crazy, dangerous, and probably impossible. But looking at the now blazing pattern beneath his feet, Eli realized that impossible might be exactly what this situation required. The storm's fury had awakened something in the cabin that Eli couldn't quite name. As he traced the pattern for the 3rd time that evening, the wooden floor beneath his fingertips seemed to pulse with a warmth that defied logic. The geometric lines carved into the ancient planks glowed faintly in the firelight, and he could swear they were growing brighter each time he completed the circuit. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling past the frosted windows. But inside, the temperature held steady, warmer than it should have been, with just the dying embers in the fireplace. Eli pulled his grandfather's journal closer, squinting at the faded ink by the dancing light. The pattern remembers, he read aloud, his breath visible in small puffs. Each generation adds to its strength, but only those who understand the sacrifice can unlock its true power. Sacrifice. The word sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold. What kind of sacrifice? And why hadn't his grandfather ever explained this to him directly? A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, and Eli's head snapped up. One of the support beams groaned under the weight of accumulated snow, and he could hear ice forming along the roof's edge. The storm was intensifying, and according to the radio's last transmission before it went dead, temperatures were dropping to record lows. 3 people in the valley had already succumbed to the cold, and emergency services couldn't reach anyone until the blizzard passed. Eli returned to the journal, flipping through pages filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting and detailed sketches of the floor pattern. Some entries dated back 50 years, others were more recent. One passage made his stomach clench. The pattern draws from the life force of the mountain itself, but it requires a conductor, someone willing to bridge the gap between the living wood and the ancient power that sleeps beneath. Sarah understood this when she saved the mining camp in '73. She walked the pattern for 3 days straight, never stopping, never resting, until the storm broke and help could arrive. The effort nearly killed her, but 47 lives were saved. Sarah, his grandmother, she had died when he was only 4, but he remembered her gentle hands and the way she used to trace shapes on his back to help him fall asleep. Had she been teaching him even then? Another section caught his eye, written in fresher ink. Eli shows promise. He feels the pattern's pull, though he doesn't understand it yet. If something happens to me, he'll need to learn quickly. The mountain's power is growing unstable. The old agreements are weakening. Old agreements? Eli's heart pounded as he realized his grandfather had been preparing him for this moment all along. Every summer visit, every story about the mountain's moods, every time they'd walked the property together, it had all been training. A new sound cut through the storm's roar, the distant crack of splitting wood. Somewhere in the valley, another structure was succumbing to the cold. How many people were trapped down there, huddled in failing shelters, watching their fires burn lower and their walls accumulate ice? Eli closed the journal and stood, his legs stiff from sitting cross-legged on the floor. The pattern stretched before him, its lines now clearly visible even in the dim light. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to complete the circuit not just with his fingers, but with his whole body. As he began to walk the pattern slowly, deliberately, following each curve and angle with careful precision, he felt something shift in the air around him. The storm's voice changed, becoming less angry and more expectant. The floor grew warmer beneath his feet, and he could sense heat beginning to radiate outward from the cabin, traveling down the mountain through underground channels he'd never imagined existed. The journal had mentioned staying on the pattern for hours, even days. Could he do that? His grandmother had nearly died from the effort, but she'd saved dozens of lives. How many people were counting on him now, even though they didn't know it? Eli thought of Mrs. Henderson from the general store, who always gave him extra candy, of the Johnson family with their twin babies, of old Mr. Pete who lived alone at the valley's edge with only his dogs for company. They were all down there somewhere, fighting the same battle against the cold that was trying to claim him. He kept walking, feeling the ancient power of the mountain flowing through him with each step, knowing that this was bigger than just surviving until morning. This was about honoring a legacy he was only beginning to understand. The wind had finally stopped screaming. Eli pressed his ear against the cabin wall, listening to the eerie silence that followed 3 days of relentless howling. The sudden quiet felt more ominous than the storm itself, like the mountain was holding its breath before delivering its next blow. He pulled his grandfather's journal closer to the dying embers of the fire, squinting at the faded ink in the orange glow. The pattern carved into the cabin floor had been glowing steadily for hours now, pulsing with that strange blue-white light that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the wood. Each symbol responded to his presence, brightening when he stepped near, dimming when he moved away. But it wasn't enough anymore. The temperature outside had plummeted beyond what the pattern alone could counteract. Ice crystals were forming on the inside of the windows despite the mysterious warmth emanating from the floor. Whatever protection the symbols offered, they needed more than just his presence to reach full power. Eli flipped through the journal pages with trembling fingers, searching for clues he might have missed. His grandfather's handwriting grew increasingly frantic in the later entries, filled with urgent warnings about the awakening and blood memory and something called the final convergence. Then he found it, a passage that made his heart race. The pattern sleeps until called by true need, but awakening requires more than desperate hope. It demands understanding, acceptance, and the willing sacrifice of one's own energy to feed the greater protection. The symbols must taste the essence of their keeper to unlock their full potential. Eli's breath caught. Sacrifice of energy, the essence of their keeper. He looked down at his hands, remembering how the cuts from his fall had healed impossibly fast after touching the glowing symbols. The pattern hadn't just responded to his presence. It had somehow drawn something from him and given something back in return. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin as another window pane succumbed to the cold. Ice-laden wind whistled through the growing gap, and Eli watched his breath form clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The pattern's glow flickered, struggling against the invasive cold. Time was running out. Eli knelt at the center of the pattern, where the largest symbol carved a perfect spiral into the floorboards. He placed both palms flat against the wood, feeling the strange warmth pulse beneath his skin like a slow heartbeat. The journal had mentioned blood, but maybe that was metaphorical. Maybe it just needed him to open himself to whatever power slept in these ancient markings. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet his racing thoughts, focusing on the rhythm of the pattern's pulse. Gradually, he felt something shift inside him, a loosening, like a door he'd never known existed was slowly creaking open. The warmth beneath his hands intensified. All around him the symbols began to glow brighter, their light shifting from blue-white to golden-amber. Eli felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something vital was being drawn from his core and channeled into the pattern. It didn't hurt exactly, but it left him feeling hollow and lightheaded. The broken window stopped whistling. The ice crystals on the glass began to melt, but the pulling sensation grew stronger, more insistent. Eli's vision blurred at the edges, and he realized with growing alarm that the pattern was taking more than he could safely give. He tried to lift his hands from the floor, but they seemed fused to the warm wood, held fast by invisible threads of energy. Too much, he thought desperately. It's taking too much. The golden light was spreading beyond the cabin now, seeping through cracks in the walls and flowing outward like luminous water. Through the unbroken windows, Eli could see it forming rivers of light that snaked down the mountainside, following paths he couldn't understand but somehow recognized. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in his ear, "The pattern protects more than just this cabin, boy. It protects the whole valley when properly awakened. But protection always comes with a price." Eli's strength was fading fast. The hollow feeling had spread through his entire body, and he could barely keep his eyes open. But even as weakness overcame him, he understood what was happening. The pattern wasn't just heating the cabin, it was creating a network of protection that extended far beyond these walls, reaching toward the valley below where people were trapped and dying. The journal had said the symbols needed the essence of their keeper. He had assumed that meant a small sacrifice, a token offering. But what if it meant something more permanent? What if awakening the pattern required giving up everything? Through his fading consciousness, Eli thought of his parents, probably frantic with worry. He thought of the emergency responders who had died trying to reach the valley. He thought of all the people still trapped out there, waiting for rescue that might never come. The golden light pulsed brighter, and Eli made his choice. Instead of fighting the pull, he surrendered to it completely, offering everything he had to the ancient protection his grandfather had left behind. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the pattern blazing like a star. The pattern beneath Eli's feet pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, each geometric line glowing brighter As the storm's fury reached a crescendo outside, he knelt on the wooden floor, tracing the intricate design with trembling fingers, trying to understand what his grandfather had been attempting to tell him through the cryptic journal entries. "The old ways remember what we have forgotten," one passage had read. "When winter's teeth bite deepest, the mountain speaks to those who listen." Eli pressed his palm flat against the center of the pattern, where all the lines converged in a spiral that seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. The sensation traveled up his arm like electricity, but gentle, familiar somehow. Images flashed through his mind, not his own memories, but something deeper, older. He saw generations of his family standing in this very spot, their hands pressed to the same design, their voices raised in words he couldn't quite grasp. 3 people were already gone. How many more would die before morning? Eli returned to the pattern, his mind racing. The journal mentioned something about amplification, about the design serving as a focal point for something his grandfather called the mountain's breath. But how could ancient symbols carved into floorboards possibly help people miles away? Connection. Eli's pulse quickened as he remembered something his grandfather had shown him last summer. The way certain rocks in the area seemed to hum when you held them just right, how the old man's hands would grow warm when he touched specific stones around the property. Racing to the cabin's back corner, Eli began moving aside stored furniture and supplies, until he found what he was looking for, a collection of smooth, crystalline rocks his grandfather had gathered over the years. Each one felt alive in his hands, vibrating with the same energy that flowed through the floor pattern. He arranged the stones around the design's perimeter, following an instinct he couldn't name but somehow trusted completely. As each rock found its place, the glow beneath his feet intensified, and the warmth in the cabin began to feel less like mere heat and more like something alive, purposeful. But it wasn't enough. The energy was building, but it had nowhere to go, no way to reach the people who needed it most. Eli closed his eyes and tried to remember everything his grandfather had taught him about the mountain, about listening to its rhythms and respecting its moods. The old man had always said that the peaks and valleys were connected in ways most people couldn't see, that energy flowed between them like blood through veins. He placed both hands on the pattern's center and focused every ounce of his intention not on the distant lights in the valley, but on the stone foundation beneath the cabin, on the bedrock that connected this high refuge to every other point on the mountain's face. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Heat surged through the floor, up the walls, and out into the night with an intensity that made Eli gasp. The very air seemed to shimmer as warmth poured from the cabin in waves, flowing down the mountainside like an invisible river. Through the howling wind, he heard something impossible, the sound of his grandfather's voice, not speaking words but humming an old melody that seemed to guide the energy, directing it toward where it was needed most. Eli added his own voice to the song, though he'd never heard it before, the notes coming to him as naturally as breathing. Together, the ancient melody and the pattern beneath his feet created something greater than either could achieve alone, a bridge of warmth spanning the frozen darkness, carrying hope to those who had nearly given up. In the valley below, the emergency flares burned brighter against the storm. The pattern beneath Eli's feet pulsed with an energy that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Each geometric line glowed brighter as he traced the ancient symbols with his fingertips, and the cabin's temperature rose steadily despite the howling storm outside. But something else was happening, something his grandfather had never mentioned in any of his stories. The floorboards themselves were changing. Where moments before there had been simple carved lines, now intricate three-dimensional symbols emerged from the wood, rising like mountain peaks in miniature. The entire floor had transformed into a topographical map, and Eli recognized the landscape immediately. It was the valley, complete with every ridge, every cabin, every road that wound through the mountain passes. "Impossible," he whispered, but his voice was swallowed by a new sound, a deep humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tiny points of light began appearing across the map. Some flickered weakly, Others burned steady and bright. Eli counted 12 lights in total, scattered across the valley floor and mountainsides. His breath caught as he realized what he was seeing. These weren't just random markers, they were people. The lights represented every soul trapped in the storm. Eli's heart raced. The town council meeting. He'd completely forgotten that half the valley's residents had planned to gather there to discuss emergency preparations for winter. The building's heating system must have failed, and now they were trapped together, their collective body heat, the only thing keeping them alive. But their light was growing dimmer by the minute. The pattern beneath his feet grew warmer, and suddenly Eli understood. This wasn't just a heating system his great-great-grandfather had built. It was a network. Each cabin, each house that the old man had helped construct over the decades contained a piece of this same geometric pattern. They were all connected like a vast web of energy that could be controlled from this central point. His grandfather had been the keeper of this secret, the guardian who could channel warmth to wherever it was needed most. And now that responsibility had fallen to Eli. He knelt and pressed both palms against the raised symbols, closing his eyes and focusing on the community center. In his mind, he could see the frightened faces of his neighbors, the school principal, the grocery store owner, elderly Mrs. Yang, who always gave him extra cookies at the bakery. They were huddled together, breath visible in small clouds, their hope fading with each degree the temperature dropped. The pattern responded to his intention. Lines of light began flowing across the floor map like glowing rivers, all converging toward the cluster of 6 flickering points. Eli felt the energy moving through him, warm and electric, drawing heat from some deep source he couldn't fully comprehend. Miles away in the valley below, the community center's ancient radiators suddenly coughed to life. Emergency power kicked in, and blessed warmth began flooding through the building. The 6 lights on Eli's map brightened immediately, their frantic pulsing settling into a steady, healthy glow. But the effort had cost him. Eli slumped backward, exhausted, and watched as 3 other lights across the valley began to dim dangerously. The network could only channel so much energy at once. Saving some meant risking others. This was the terrible burden his grandfather had carried in secret. Every storm, every crisis, he'd been forced to make impossible choices about who lived and who died. The responsibility would have crushed a lesser man, but somehow the old mountain guide had found a way to save almost everyone, year after year, without anyone knowing the truth. Eli wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air still seeping through the cabin walls. He had to learn to balance the energy flow, to spread the warmth more evenly. 3 more people were counting on him, their lights growing fainter with each passing moment. He placed his hands on different sections of the pattern, experimenting with the flow. When he touched the symbols near his own location, warmth flooded the cabin. When he focused on the outer edges of the map, he could feel the energy streaming toward the distant lights. Slowly, carefully, he began to adjust the network. A little less power to the community center, where 6 people could share body heat. More energy to the isolated cabin where someone was trapped alone. The 3 dimming lights gradually strengthened, and Eli allowed himself a small smile of relief. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, but for the first time since the storm began, every light in the valley burned steady and bright. Eli had become the guardian his family's legacy demanded, the keeper of secrets that meant the difference between life and death for his entire community. The real test, however, was just beginning. The rescue snowmobile's engine cut through the mountain silence like a chainsaw, its headlights sweeping across the snow-laden pines as it approached the cabin. Eli pressed his face against the frosted window, watching 3 figures dismount from the vehicle. His heart hammered against his ribs. After 5 days alone, seeing other people felt surreal. "Eli Rodriguez?" The lead rescuer's voice boomed across the clearing. "We're with Mountain Rescue. Your parents sent us." Eli opened the door, cold air rushing past him into the warm cabin. The lead rescuer, a bearded man in his 40s, stopped short when the wave of heat hit him. Behind him, two younger rescuers exchanged glances. "Son, how are you keeping this place so warm?" The bearded man stepped inside, pulling off his goggles. "Our thermometers are reading 40 below out here. The pattern," Eli said simply, gesturing toward the floor. "My grandfather left instructions." The rescuers followed his gaze to the intricate arrangement of stones, crystals, and metal pieces that covered most of the cabin's floor space. The pattern seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth, the crystals catching and reflecting the firelight in impossible ways. "What in the hell?" one of the younger rescuers whispered. The bearded man, his name tag read Torres, knelt beside the pattern, holding his gloved hand over the stones. "This is generating heat, real heat." He looked up at Eli with new respect. "Kid, do you understand what you've discovered here?" "I think so." Eli pulled out his grandfather's journal, its pages now filled with his own notes and observations. "My grandfather wasn't just a caretaker. He was trying to solve something. The valley's been getting colder for decades, and people have been dying." Torres stood slowly, speaking into his radio. "Base, this is Rescue 7. We've located the boy, and he's in excellent condition. But we need to delay extraction. We may have found something significant here." Static crackled back. "Copy that, 7. What's your situation?" Torres looked around the impossibly warm cabin again. "We need to contact the University Geology Department, and maybe someone from the Historical Society. This cabin is sitting on something extraordinary." Over the next hour, Eli explained everything he'd learned. How the floor pattern channeled geothermal energy through a network of underground crystal formations. How his grandfather had spent years mapping the thermal signatures across the entire valley. How the pattern wasn't just keeping the cabin warm, it was unlocking a natural heating system that could warm every building in the community below. "The whole valley sits on a dormant volcanic system," Eli explained, tracing the patterns in his grandfather's journal. "But the energy's been blocked by mineral deposits for decades. The crystals in this pattern, they're resonating at specific frequencies that clear those blockages." The youngest rescuer, barely out of college himself, shook his head in amazement. "This is like something out of a science fiction movie." "No," Torres said grimly, speaking into his radio again. "Base, we need immediate coordination with the Valley Emergency Services. If this kid is right, we might be able to save the people still trapped down there." Through the radio static came an urgent voice. 7. We've got 14 families still without heat in the lower valley. 2 more hospitalizations in the last hour. Whatever you've found up there, we need it now." Eli felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy pack. "The pattern has to be bigger," he said quietly. "My grandfather's notes show this is just one node in a larger network. We need to activate the other sites." He spread his grandfather's hand-drawn map across the small table, showing Torres the locations marked throughout the valley. "Here, here, and here," Eli pointed. "If we can recreate smaller versions of this pattern at these 3 sites, we can channel warmth to the entire community." Torres studied the map, his expression growing more serious. "These locations, they're all accessible by snowmobile, but we'd need exact specifications for recreating the pattern." "I have them." Eli tapped his own notebook, where he'd carefully documented every measurement, every crystal placement, every angle of the stone arrangements. "I've been studying this for days. I know how it works." The radio crackled again. "Rescue 7, what's your timeline? We're running out of time down here." Torres looked at Eli, then at the warm, life-saving pattern spread across the cabin floor. "Base, we're going to need some specialized equipment in about 6 hours. But if this works—" He paused, watching the crystals pulse with their mysterious energy. "If this works, we might just save everyone." Eli closed his grandfather's journal and zipped up his coat. After 5 days alone in the mountains, he was finally ready to leave the cabin. But he wasn't running from the cold anymore. He was carrying the warmth with him, ready to share his grandfather's secret with a valley full of people who desperately needed hope. The real rescue mission was just beginning. The radio crackled to life with Sheriff Martinez's voice, cutting through the howling wind that still battered the cabin walls. "Eli, come in! We've got a problem down here." Eli's stomach dropped as he reached for the handset, his fingers still trembling from the energy that had coursed through him during the pattern ritual. The carved symbols on the floor seemed to pulse faintly in his peripheral vision, as if they were still processing what had just occurred. "I'm here, Sheriff. What's happening?" "The warming stations we set up aren't holding. The generators are failing one by one, and we've got families with small children who won't make it through another night. The temperature's dropping faster than our equipment can compensate for." The sheriff's voice was tight with desperation. "That thing you did earlier, whatever it was, we need more of it." Eli looked down at the pattern beneath his feet, its ancient lines now seeming to glow with an inner warmth. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, revealing pages he hadn't noticed before. The leather binding had somehow loosened, exposing hidden sections that detailed not just the cabin's pattern, but a network of similar designs throughout the valley. "There are others," Eli whispered, running his finger along a hand-drawn map. Grandfather mapped them all. His great-grandfather's careful notations filled the margins, describing how the mountain's early settlers had discovered the patterns in caves and incorporated them into the foundations of key buildings throughout the community. The old church, the town hall, even the original schoolhouse, all built on sites where the strange geometric designs had been found carved into the bedrock. "Sheriff, you need to get people to specific buildings. I'm looking at a map that shows..." A massive crack echoed through the cabin, and Eli spun around to see a spider web of fractures spreading across the main window. The glass held, but barely. Outside, the blizzard seemed to be intensifying rather than subsiding, as if something was fighting against the warmth he'd generated. His grandfather's journal entry from 3 winters ago caught his eye. The pattern fights back when activated. The mountain doesn't give up its cold easily. Each warming requires a deeper connection, a greater sacrifice of self. "I'm here. Listen carefully. Get everyone to the old church on Main Street. The foundation has one of the patterns. Mrs. Henderson will know where to find the basement entrance. There's a hidden room behind the furnace." "How do you know all this?" Eli stared at the journal, where his grandfather had documented decades of small activations, each one taking a little more from him. The final entry, written just days before the old man's death, was barely legible. "The mountain remembers everything. It gives warmth, but it takes memories in return. Soon I won't remember Sarah's face or the sound of Eli's laughter, but the people will be safe." The terrible understanding hit Eli like a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't died of old age. He'd traded his memories, his very sense of self, to keep the valley warm during countless harsh winters. Each activation of the pattern had cost him pieces of who he was. "Eli." Sheriff Martinez's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The church," Eli repeated mechanically. "Get them to the church. I'll activate the pattern there, but you need to tell me when everyone's inside." He was already moving, gathering his grandfather's journal and the emergency pack, his body operating on autopilot, while his mind reeled from the revelation. Outside the cabin, the snow had drifted nearly to the windows, but the path his grandfather had carved earlier remained mysteriously clear. The trek down the mountain was a nightmare of wind and ice, but something seemed to be guiding him, keeping him on the safest route. The pattern's influence, perhaps, or his grandfather's spirit looking out for him one last time. By the time he reached the church, families were already streaming inside, their faces hollow with cold and fear. Mrs. Henderson met him at the door, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Your grandfather told me this day might come," she said, leading him toward the basement stairs. "He made me promise to help you, but Eli, you need to understand what you're about to do." "I know," Eli said quietly, though the words felt like they belonged to someone else. "I know what it costs." The basement pattern was larger than the one in the cabin, more intricate, carved deep into stone that seemed to predate the building above. As Eli knelt at its center, he could feel the mountain's ancient power stirring beneath him, hungry for what it had always demanded in exchange for warmth. Above them, the voices of dozens of families echoed through the church, parents comforting children, everyone depending on a 12-year-old boy who was about to trade pieces of himself to save them all. The ancient symbols pulsed beneath Eli's feet as he traced the final sequence, each step sending warmth radiating through the cabin's wooden floor. Outside, the blizzard still raged, but something had fundamentally shifted. The temperature inside held steady, defying the brutal cold that had claimed 3 lives in the valley below. His grandfather's journal lay open beside him, the cramped handwriting revealing secrets that stretched back generations. The floor pattern wasn't just a heating system, it was a conduit, a way to channel the mountain's geothermal energy through carefully placed stones and precisely carved channels. But more than that, it was a responsibility passed down through his family line, one his grandfather had intended to teach him when he turned 16. The blizzard had forced Eli to learn it 4 years early. A distant rumble caught his attention, different from the howling wind. He pressed his ear to the window, listening intently. There it was again, the low drone of an engine struggling against the storm. Someone was coming up the mountain road, though how they were managing it in this weather seemed impossible. Eli grabbed his grandfather's binoculars and peered through the frost-covered glass. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the orange bulk of a county snowplow, its blade cutting a narrow path through drifts that reached nearly to its hood. Behind it, a convoy of emergency vehicles followed in single file. His heart leaped. They were coming for him, but more importantly, they might be heading to the valley settlement, where families were trapped in houses that couldn't possibly withstand another night of this cold. He thought of Mrs. Chen at the general store, always sneaking him extra candy when his grandfather wasn't looking. Of the Kowalski twins who helped him build snow forts every winter. Of old Mr. Peterson, who carved wooden animals for all the children in the valley. They were all down there, probably huddled around failing heating systems, burning furniture to stay alive. The pattern beneath his feet pulsed brighter, as if responding to his thoughts. According to the journal, his great-great-grandfather had used this same system during the legendary winter of 1887, when temperatures dropped so low that even the river froze solid. But he hadn't just saved himself. He'd somehow extended the warmth to reach the entire valley settlement. Eli flipped frantically through the journal pages, searching for the method. There, near the back, he found a hand-drawn map showing the mountain's underground network of natural caves and thermal vents. Red lines connected various points, forming a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the one carved into the cabin floor, only much larger. The cabin wasn't the end point, it was the beginning. His grandfather had written, "The mountain remembers. When the old ways are honored, she shares her warmth with all who need it. But the price is commitment. Once the full pattern is activated, the keeper must remain until the danger passes." Eli's hands trembled as he read those words. The convoy outside was struggling, their progress slowing as the storm intensified. At their current rate, they might not reach the valley settlement for hours, possibly not until morning. Too late for anyone still clinging to life in houses where the cold had already crept through every wall. He looked again at the map, tracing the underground connections with his finger. There were 7 anchor points spread across the mountain's face, each one corresponding to a natural hot spring or thermal vent. If he could activate them in sequence, following the same principle as the cabin's floor pattern, the warmth could flow downhill through the mountain's natural channels, emerging at strategic points throughout the valley. But to do it, he would have to leave the cabin's safety and venture out into the storm. The rescue convoy's lights grew brighter, but their progress had slowed to a crawl. Through the binoculars, Eli could see crew members getting out to clear debris from the road. They were still miles from the valley settlement, fighting for every yard of progress. He made his decision. Moving quickly, Eli gathered supplies into his grandfather's old hiking pack, the journal, a flashlight, emergency flares, rope, and the carved wooden medallion his grandfather always wore around his neck. According to the journal, the medallion was the key, literally. Each anchor point had a corresponding slot where it would fit, completing the circuit. As he prepared to step off the floor pattern, the warmth immediately began to fade from the cabin. The ancient system was tied to intention and presence. It would hold for a while without him, but not indefinitely. Eli pulled on his heaviest coat and checked his supplies one final time. The first anchor point was only a quarter-mile down the mountain, marked by a distinctive rock formation his grandfather had shown him during their summer hikes. If the journal was right, if the old stories were true, he could create a network of warmth that would reach every home in the valley. He opened the cabin door, and the storm's fury struck him like a physical blow. Snow stung his face, and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. The ancient symbols beneath Eli's feet pulsed with renewed intensity as he pressed his palms against the cabin's wooden walls. The pattern had grown beyond the floorboards now, spreading like living veins of light up the walls and across the ceiling. Each geometric line thrummed with warmth that seemed to flow directly from the mountain's heart. Outside, the blizzard raged with supernatural fury, but inside the cabin, Eli felt the presence of generations of his family. Their knowledge whispered through the glowing lines, teaching him what his grandfather had never had the chance to explain. The pattern wasn't just a heating system, it was a conduit, a way to channel the mountain's geothermal energy through precise mathematical sequences that his ancestors had discovered centuries ago. Eli closed his eyes and let the knowledge flow through him. He understood now why his grandfather had been so secretive, why the other families in the valley had forgotten their heritage. This power was dangerous in the wrong hands, capable of triggering avalanches or volcanic activity if misused. But it was also salvation for those who knew how to respect it. The radio crackled to life, Sarah's voice cutting through the static with desperate urgency. "Eli, can you hear me? The temperature's dropping faster now. We've lost 2 more families to hypothermia. The rescue helicopter crashed trying to reach the Morrison place. If you can hear this, we need whatever help you can give us. The whole valley is depending on you." Eli opened his eyes, staring at the complex web of light that now covered every surface of the cabin. His grandfather's journal lay open on the table, its pages fluttering despite the absence of any wind inside. The final entry, written in his grandfather's shaking handwriting, seemed to glow with its own inner light. "The mountain remembers all debts. What we take we must give back tenfold. The boy will understand when the time comes." Understanding crashed over Eli like a breaking wave. His grandfather hadn't just been teaching him to survive, he'd been preparing him to save everyone. But the pattern required more than knowledge, it demanded sacrifice. To extend the warming field beyond the cabin, to reach the entire valley, would drain him completely. There was no guarantee he would survive the process. Eli thought of Sarah, alone in her house with dwindling firewood, of the Morrison family trapped somewhere in the snow, of all the people in the valley who had trusted his grandfather over the years, never knowing the true source of the old man's uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and avalanche risks. His hands moved without conscious thought, tracing symbols in the air above the central pattern. The geometric lines responded, brightening and shifting, rearranging themselves into configurations he somehow knew by heart. The warmth in the cabin intensified until sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't stop. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath as Eli began the sequence his ancestors had used only in the most desperate circumstances. Power flowed up through the bedrock, drawn by the pattern's magnetic pull. The cabin groaned and shuddered as energy coursed through its walls, transforming it into a beacon of impossible heat. Eli felt his strength beginning to ebb as the pattern demanded more of him. His vision blurred, but he could see the warmth spreading beyond the cabin now, melting snow in an ever-widening circle. The radio burst into excited chatter as people throughout the valley reported sudden spikes in temperature, frozen pipes thawing, and snowdrifts beginning to recede. "It's working," Sarah's voice came through clearly now, filled with wonder. "Eli, I don't know how you're doing this, but the temperature here just jumped 20 degrees. The whole town is warming up. You did it. But Eli wasn't finished. The pattern showed him one final configuration, more complex than all the others. If he could complete it, the mountain's warmth would break the blizzard's supernatural grip entirely, ensuring the valley's safety for years to come. The cost, however, would be everything he had left. He thought of his grandfather's last words, "Some gifts are worth any price." Eli understood now that his grandfather hadn't died from the cold. He had given his life force to keep the cabin warm long enough for Eli to discover his heritage. With trembling hands, Eli began tracing the final sequence. The pattern blazed with blinding intensity, and somewhere far below, the mountain's ancient heart responded with a pulse that shook the entire valley. The blizzard's howling changed pitch, becoming a wail of defeat as unnatural cold gave way to the earth's enduring warmth. Eli collapsed to his knees as the last symbol fell into place. The pattern's light dimmed to a gentle glow, but its warmth remained constant. Through the radio static, he heard voices throughout the valley expressing amazement as the storm began to break apart, revealing patches of star-filled sky. He had done it. The valley was safe, but as darkness crept in around the edges of his vision, Eli wondered if he would live to see the dawn. The aurora borealis painted the sky in impossible shades of green and gold as Eli stepped out of the cabin one final time. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the dancing lights above. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, but the bone-deep cold that had threatened to claim him felt different now, manageable, almost respectful. Behind him, the ancient pattern in the floorboards hummed with a gentle warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He'd covered it carefully with the old rug, just as grandfather had always done, but he could still feel its presence. The secret wasn't meant to be hidden forever, but it wasn't meant to be carelessly exposed either. Some knowledge required wisdom to wield properly. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the mountain silence, growing stronger with each passing moment. Eli pulled his grandfather's coat tighter around his shoulders and walked to the clearing where he'd tramped down the snow into a makeshift landing zone. The rescue helicopter appeared over the tree line like a mechanical angel, its spotlight sweeping across the white landscape before finding him. As the aircraft settled onto the snow with a powerful downdraft that sent crystals swirling around him, Eli felt a profound mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that his ordeal was ending, that he'd survived what had claimed 3 others in the valley below. Sadness that he was leaving this place that had taught him so much about himself, about his family's hidden legacy. The helicopter door slid open and a rescue worker in bright orange gear jumped out, followed immediately by a familiar figure that made Eli's heart leap. His mother ran toward him through the snow, her face streaked with tears that froze almost instantly in the mountain air. "Eli!" She swept him into her arms with a force that nearly knocked him over, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Oh God, we thought we'd lost you. When the storm hit and we couldn't reach the cabin." "I'm okay, Mom," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I figured it out. I figured out what Grandfather was trying to tell us." She pulled back to look at him, her hands cupping his face as she searched his eyes. What she saw there made her expression change from relief to something deeper, more complex. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "The pattern," she whispered. "You found it. You knew?" Eli stared at her in amazement. "You knew about the heat, about what the cabin could do?" His mother nodded slowly, glancing toward the rescue worker who was checking Eli for signs of hypothermia. "Not everything. Your grandfather... He tried to explain it to me once when I was about your age, but I wasn't ready to listen. I thought it was just old mountain superstition." "It's not superstition," Eli said firmly. "It saved my life, and it could save others." The rescue worker, a weathered man with kind eyes, looked up from his examination. "Son, you've been alone up here for 4 days in sub-zero temperatures. By all rights, you should be suffering from severe hypothermia or worse. I've seen grown men with full survival gear who didn't fare as well in conditions like these. The cabin protected me, Eli said simply, just like it protected my grandfather and his grandfather before him. As they prepared to board the helicopter, Eli turned back toward the cabin one last time. In the shifting light of the aurora, he could swear he saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall and familiar, wearing a red flannel shirt and raising one hand in farewell. But when he blinked, there was only shadow and snow. During the flight down the mountain, Eli pressed his face to the window and watched the scattered lights of the valley communities appear below. Each cluster of warm yellow lights represented families, people who had huddled together during the storm, some of whom hadn't made it through. The knowledge he carried felt heavy with responsibility. "Mom," he said over the noise of the rotors, "we have to come back. We have to learn how to use what Grandfather left us." She squeezed his hand, her own still trembling slightly. "I know, sweetheart. I think I've always known." The helicopter banked toward the valley's main town, where warm lights promised hot food, medical attention, and the comfort of civilization. But Eli found himself already planning his return to the mountain. The pattern in the cabin floor was more than just a family secret now. It was a responsibility, a trust passed down through generations that he finally understood. Below them, the aurora continued its ancient dance across the sky, and somewhere in the mountains behind them, an old cabin settled into patient silence, waiting for the next keeper of its mysteries to return.